and welcome to the Dynasty Nerd Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Rich Dotson. He's Garret Price.
How's it going?
Surprise, surprise, Nerd Herd. Got a little bonus podcast come out here. You know, we always talk about, like, when we do these guest shows, we always put them on YouTube. And, you know, we feel that when we bring certain guests in and they have some very valuable information, not everybody watches a YouTube show. We still have to put out a podcast form. And that's something we've always, you know, never done. We did the Matt Harmon one, but like we've had some really smart people in the business. Well, it'd be Matt Harmon, Andy Holloway, etc. Ray Garvin, like on the show, and it's always just on YouTube. And you know, we know that our largest audience reach is going to be the podcast, and we love you, Nerd Herd. So we decided anytime we do some of these shows, we're going to put out here in a podcast form today. And today we are blessed and lucky enough to bring on one of the great people in the industry, Garret.
Yeah. JJ Zacharyson's joining us on this show. We did a Dynasty or a YouTube show with him, and it was a great show. He had some really good information, and he is like the king of having great statistics to back up his analysis. He's always digging into the weeds. He was even talking to us afterward about, you know, how nerdy he likes to get into his draft guides and all of that kind of stuff. And so he's a sharp dude. We got an opportunity to meet him while we were in Canton for the Fantasy Football Expo. Great dude. He, you know, most of the people that we have on, it's exactly like that. Like the way they sound in podcast form, like they're the same way in real life. Like they're good dudes or ladies, and we had a great time. So we figured, like, why not? Like let's have them on here, and we're talking sleepers, Rich. Which I always love talking sleepers, because that's such like, if you hit on a sleeper, it changes everything.
Yeah, I mean that's the difference of winning your league or not in some of these redraft leagues, right? Like everybody follows the guide, they're following where they're supposed to go, and it gets pretty chalky. But like once you get through the weeds and fill out your starting lineup, it's like, where is the value and where do I reach outside my ADP to outproduce my points per game, predicted points per game, right? And we have a couple guys each. We have two guys in here that I loved all six of these picks. I think we hit almost every position here except for the tight end position. But if you're looking for some tight ends, you're looking at, you know, the guys I'm grabbing at the back end of my draft are Jonnu Smith, Zach Ertz, Mike Gesicki, and Kobe Parkinson. Like those are guys that I think have a good chance to outproduce their ADP, especially like a guy like Jonnu Smith. All those guys have really good reports coming out of camp so far. So we hit all the positions. We talk about some sleepers, where they're going in ADP, and what we kind of could think they can do in the 2024 NFL season. And, you know, from a dynasty standpoint, you know, if they're going this far back in ADP, you just go look at, like, these are great trade targets as well. So anybody that falls outside of ADP that late, that means they're you know, acquirable in Dynasty. So even though this is going to help out for your redraft leagues, you might find some nuggets in this episode that, like, hey, you know what? I'm in a win now mode. I'm going to go out and make some trades and see what I can get for this player. I know I put a trade out there for one of my sleeper wide receivers, and I offered Zeke Elliott for him. And, you know, I look at it as a win-win situation. They get a running back on a short-term basis, and I get a wide receiver on a short-term basis. So sleepers are fun. And like I mentioned in the show with JJ, it's in this day and age, it's so hard to find sleepers that people aren't talking about. Because anywhere you turn on your TV or any podcast you turn on, everybody's talking about the exact same guys as sleepers. And what I like about this show is I feel like we pivoted and we all talked about some guys that I haven't really read online or other sites that people are talking about. So I think this episode will really give you kind of a different insight on some guys that can help you win now in the 2024 season.
No, I think that's a great call. Yeah, it's not the same regurgitated stuff that you get everywhere else. We have our own bias here at Dynasty Nerds, and so it's good to check that with other people like JJ, and he does a great job of kind of breaking down his two guys that he brought into the fold into this conversation, a running back and a wide receiver for him. Rich, you had a wide receiver and a quarterback, and I had a running back and a wide receiver to cover. So we got a lot of the bases covered. So Rich, I think without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Let's talk to one of the best minds in the fantasy football business today, JJ Zachariason.
Welcome back to the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. I'm your host, Garret Price. I've got my good friend Rich Dotson with me. Rich, how you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing splendid. We're talking sleepers, but I'm wide awake and excited. So this is fun.
Look at you.
Get
Wide-eyed
good.
and bushy-tailed, and we have an awesome guest with us today. Love his content. I'm sure you're a big fan of his if you're watching right now. JJ Zachariason. JJ, how are you doing, my man?
I'm good. Like we said, I feel like I was talking to you guys yesterday because I basically was talking to you guys yesterday at the Fantasy Football Expo. But it's good to see your smiling faces.
Absolutely. So, JJ, before we get into everything, obviously late round quarterback, that's been your brand for a long time, but you have so many things that you do, so many things that you're working on. Give a quick plug to what you have going on.
Yeah, right now it's really, it's season long redraft season. So I do a draft guide every year that's, like 80% game theory driven. It's like 200 plus pages long. And then the final 20% is the typical like players to target, players to avoid, the stuff that, people want. I always love whenever someone buys the guide and they're like, they immediately email me a question about like the rankings and stuff. And I'm like, dude, I just spent like 150 pages with like deep game theory discussion and like a lot of research. And you're only worried about whether this is half PPR or full PPR. So yeah, I've got the draft guide that's out there. Obviously the late round podcast, that's sort of been my baby within the space. And then during the off season, it's a lot of prospect work. I have a model that I reference all the time. And I do the late round prospect guide during the winter months.
Awesome. Well, I know I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. One of our other guys, Jared Wackerly, I swear he references you like every other week where he's like, well, JJ says. I was like, oh, well, JJ said it then. But we are getting into some sleepers today, and we're going to be talking about guys that might not have the highest ADP, but we think are good values to target in your drafts for the 2024 season. So JJ, with you being the guest, we'll let you go first, then Rich, and I'll bring up the rear.
All right, so let's start with Jaleel McLaughlin out of Denver. It's actually interesting because if you look at history and you look at running backs that are playing with rookie quarterbacks, I have this thing where I look at players versus ADP expectations. So that's just by charting ADP on the x-axis, you get on the y-axis points per game, and you do that over the last, I used since 2014. You do it over the last decade. You can find a trend line that basically tells you what we would expect a certain position to score at a certain ADP, right? Just based on what we've seen historically. And what I found is that running backs that have rookie quarterbacks generally don't outperform that ADP expectation at as good of a rate as some alternative groups, right? Basically groups that would not have a rookie quarterback. They can, beat expectation, but they don't generally like far exceed that expectation. So you look at like a Miles Sanders last year. Obviously there were, instances as to why he didn't necessarily perform, or like even like a Dameon Pierce last year. Now, obviously there's reasons why he didn't perform, but a lot of the bottom line as to why that's the case is because these offenses with rookie quarterbacks generally don't perform as well as the market sometimes think. Right. And so the interesting thing is I still think that the Denver backs are interesting in season long still this year. And it mostly has to do with scheme and it has to do with Sean Payton. One of the craziest things that I found in my research this offseason was if you look at the top 17 team running back target share seasons since 2011, now I say 17, we could say top 20, but it's technically the top 17. 8 of the top 17 team running back target share seasons came from Sean Payton led teams, which is wild because he wasn't even a coach throughout that entire period, right? He had some time off. Now, obviously people will say, oh, that's an Alvin Kamara statistic. It's not really. I mean, he's done it throughout his entire tenure, different teams. Even last year, you look at Denver and they led the league in running back team target share. And so, you look at this backfield right now. I do think that, obviously if they don't cut Samaje Perine, he'll be somewhat in the way for a guy like McLaughlin. But I think if you look at what they're working with at running back, you're looking at Javonte Williams as sort of like the early down pseudo bell cow, but not totally because we know that Peyton splits his backfields. Then you have Audric Estime, who they draft, who is an early down bruiser. He had a pretty questionable receiving profile, and they've even come out and said that this is an early down guy, and that's the way that, at least from this point, he's a younger player too, but from year one, we should probably expect that to be the case. And so you're looking at McLaughlin as a guy who last year, if you look at basically any per rush metric, and I don't love to do this because there's not that much stickiness year over year with some of these numbers, but if you look at almost any per rush metric, even per route run stuff, they looked good. The whole team looked good. The whole backfield did on a per route run basis last year, but per touch, Jaleel McLaughlin was light years better than what they had out of Samaje Perine and Javonte Williams, even when you adjust for the type of fronts that they were facing. And so, I don't think McLaughlin is someone who has necessarily top 5, top 10 upside. I think that would be kind of ridiculous to think, given his size and given the fact that he's a UDFA. There's not going to be that much investment in a player like that. But could he kind of play a Sproulsian type role in this offense? I think so. And you look at the offense in general, there's not a lot of alternatives right now at pass catcher. There is, I'm not a big vacated targets guy, but I am from a projection standpoint looking at a 100% target share pie that you then have to divvy up. And Courtland Sutton's the only guy that we really feel comfortable with right now amongst those pass catchers to have a locked in target share. So I think we're looking at another season where this backfield gets targeted a whole lot. And to me, Jaleel McLaughlin's just a pretty safe pick late in your draft.
Yeah, I like how you said that too with the target share with Courtland Sutton, where Courtland Sutton, who's never even really been a wide receiver too, right? Like you have Tim Patrick out there coming off an Achilles injury. They have Marvin Mims, who they traded up for a year ago, who the Sean Payton likes. Not a lot of options out there. And you mentioned the history of Sean Payton, and Darren Sproles is just such a great example, like a very fantasy relevant PPR running back. And everybody should know, like if you are a running back, like you want the guys who are catching passes, like those guys alone, like the James Whites, the Darren Sproles, the Danny Woodheads. Those guys are always, you always find one of those guys usually that sneak into that low end wide receiver 1 range just on their pass catching ability alone. And that's what Sean Payton brings to there. And, I say on the podcast all the time, like system and coaches matter, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you're at the bar and you're going to hit on somebody of the sex that you're into, like, and you have 2 options and one is drop dead gorgeous and one is not, like, you know which way you're going to lean to. And certain schemes and certain coaches are the drop dead systems, Mike McDaniels, Sean McVay, Sean Payton, historically, like you want to trend to those offenses and those targets. And Jaleel McLaughlin, as a pass catcher running back, where nobody else in that system really does that, does offer that encouragement. Like you said, could he somehow sneak his way into with injuries to be a low end wide receiver running back 1? That's always on a possibility for anybody. But when you talk sleepers, definitely in 2024, like it is so hard in this day and age to talk about somebody that somebody doesn't know about or where they're going to come from.
Oh, 100%.
They are everywhere. So when we're talking sleepers for the audience, like we're just trying to find really good ADP value that you're grabbing the back end of the draft that you could put in your starting lineup. Somebody that's going to help propel you into your playoffs and then potentially help you win the championship, where you're getting them for free. Like you already have your starting lineup set, but these are guys that, my favorite thing is, I don't draft this guy to trade him. I draft a guy like Jaleel McLaughlin, so he puts me in a position so I could trade Jonathan Taylor for a position of need and get the wide receiver I need, get the quarterback I need, because I know his points per game on an in-game basis is like 3 to 4 points off, but where I'm going to make it up is I'm getting a wide receiver that gives me a 6 to 7 point differential instead, where like people are always trying to find that low end to trade. I like to find those sleepers to put in my starting lineup and then trade the guy who has the actual name value to really push my team into the limit. And I think Jaleel McLaughlin fits that to an absolute T. Love it.
Awesome. Well, Rich, you covered it well. So I'll let you go ahead and get into your guy there right after we talked about Jaleel McLaughlin.
Yeah, so I got a guy who's not very popular in the NFL today, and to his own endeavors, he's going to be on high people's Christmas card list here. But mine's Deshaun Watson, quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, and I just really see good value here. Currently going right now, if you look at Fantasy Pros ADP, is quarterback number 22 off the board. So literally going as like the last guy in your league's backup quarterback. And when we talk about pass catcher running backs, that's what you're looking for in fantasy. What's the number one attribute that you look for in quarterbacks in fantasy? It's not like, are they going to throw for 4,000 yards when everybody's throwing for pretty close to 4,000 yards? You want the quarterback that brings rushing upside. Like that's where the juice is. And Deshaun Watson brings that to the table. And listen, he hasn't done anything for the last couple of years, whether it be contract holdout, legal issues, or injuries. He's been off the field. But historically, when you look at a guy like Deshaun Watson, up until that, he's always been a quarterback 1, right? Like as a rookie, before he got hurt, weeks 1 through 8, quarterback 2 overall. 2017, quarterback 4, followed by quarterback 5 in back-to-back years. And then if you skip ahead to after all this controversy, as a Cleveland Browns quarterback, every week that he played, he played in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 weeks here. He was a quarterback 1 last year. Every week he played except for 2. And even in that 1, he was quarterback 14. So he was a high quarterback 2. And the game that he was quarterback 27 was that Pittsburgh game where Chubb went down night game. Everything kind of went off the rails for him. Had some fumbles, some bad interceptions. I know, I was there. It hurt my heart. So outside of that, historically, we're talking about somebody who's won at every level he's ever played, from high school to college to the NFL. He's been a successful quarterback. He's still right around 28 years old, so he hasn't really fallen off the rails. And if you look at the Cleveland offense, bringing in Ken Dorsey, they really want to take this offense and move it to a quick pace, which is they're already, I think, top 10 in plays per game there. So they want to make just a fast-paced offense. And without Nick Chubb, and I honestly think even with Nick Chubb there, they still want to run this kind of offense, a fast-paced offense throwing the football. And kind of look at it somewhat like a better Green Bay offense when it comes to receiving core. They have a lot of good guys there. Like they don't have the Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown, but Amari Cooper, a wide receiver, 1 last year. They bring in Jerry Jeudy, a former first-round pick, who's a very savvy route runner. Questionable hands. We'll see if we can put together this year. And Elijah Moore, same issue, followed by David Njoku with some good back-end guys that have some upside, like Cedric Tillman, former third-round pick of last year. So for a quarterback that can run behind a very solid offensive line that brings that rushing ability, that right now has a very questionable run game, so they could definitely roll out Deshaun Watson way more than they did in the previous years. I think get a guy at quarterback 22 who already showed last year in the same players around him could be a quarterback 1 on a week in, week out basis. That's tremendous value that you're getting at the very back end of your draft as your quarterback 2.
Yeah, he is a very interesting name. And obviously there's a sour taste in people's mouths about Deshaun Watson, but at the end of the day, we are playing a game. And we're trying to get the most points, and can he be a guy that gets us the most points? So is he somebody that you would be willing to take, JJ, as your QB2? Because that's where he's going ADP-wise in your redraft league this year. Would you be willing to take him as your quarterback 2 if you have a guy that maybe like an Anthony Richardson that's a little more injury-prone or somebody like that? Is that somebody you'd be open to targeting?
Yeah, I mean, I have Watson 4 or 5 spots ahead of just within the quarterback rankings ahead of ADP. Another point to make is that last year, you mentioned his QB1 performances. He hit 20 or more standard fantasy points at a top 12 rate in fantasy football last year. If you don't count the game that he was injured in and didn't really throw that much. So I mean, look, it's very rare and difficult to find mobile quarterbacks late these days. And, he's not going to give you the same type of mobility that he did earlier in his career, on a points per game basis, but he's still going to give you more than a lot of the pocket, like than a Jared Goff and some of these other guys that'll go in that mid QB2 range. I think that he has just as much upside, just given that he has that a little bit more of a floor with his legs. And like you mentioned, I think that people are just kind of ignoring the Ken Dorsey thing and that they're going to run a lot more spread. They're probably going to run at a faster pace. They're going to throw the ball a lot. That's what we've seen with Dorsey offenses so far in the NFL. And they have weapons to be able to do that too, right? Like they add Jerry Jeudy. Hypothetically, the weapons there are set up well for Deshaun Watson. So yeah, I'm in on Watson this year. I was in on him a little bit last year too, but this year it's even easier because he's just going so late.
Absolutely. So let's get to my first guy here for the Sleepers episode. And I'm going with Demario Pop Douglas. Yes, Demario Douglas here, wide receiver for the New England Patriots. And recently, Evan Laser, one of their beat writers, was quoted as saying, the only question the coaches should have with Demario Douglas is whether he can stay healthy as a high-volume receiver. Douglas is the Patriots' most dynamic playmaker by far, with the ability to instantly separate on the quick hitters or break free with dynamic downfield routes. Plus, he's a jitterbug as a ball carrier with immense yak potential. You look at what this kid did last year. He hit as a rookie that 500-yard threshold, which, if you heard some of our earlier episodes, we kind of did a deep dive into what metrics matter for each position. And that's something that really matters for the rookie wide receivers. You have about a 2% chance to actually hit as a wide receiver on a regular basis if you did not hit that 500-yard threshold as a rookie. So he hit the 500-yard threshold. Last year, he was fantastic in yards after catch. Looking at players with at least a 15% target share, Pop Douglas was second in yards after catch, only behind the great Deebo Samuel. You look at this room. It's completely depleted. Like, there's nobody in this room that you're like, oh yeah, that guy's going to be getting tons of targets this year. That guy's really established. We have Kendrick Bourne there, who's been there forever, and he's a fine player. You have the second-round pick in Polk, and then Javon Baker's been getting some buzz. But overall, it's a completely wide-open room. All the beat reporters, all the guys are saying, this guy looks the part. He looks like that guy that can be an absolute difference maker. And then you look at this situation. It looks like for right now, Jacoby Brissett's going to be the quarterback for this season. At some point, it wouldn't be a surprise to see Drake May hop in and get some work. But right now, it looks like it's going to be mostly Jacoby Brissett. Jacoby Brissett, if you look at his air yards per target over the course of his career, he's usually middling to late. Like, he's not a guy that's going to be deep downfield stuff. You add into that PFF ranks this offensive line as the 28th ranked offensive line in football. So there's not going to be a ton of time for him to throw the ball. So what do? You throw it to your low A-dot guys and hope they can get yards after the catch. That's exactly what you get out of Demario Douglas. So I think this year for Pop Douglas, right now on Underdog, he's going off the board as wide receiver 71. So, I mean, it's such a good value that even if he doesn't fully break out and have a monster season, still at that ADP, even if he only gets you 900 yards and 5 touchdowns, you're still thrilled with that production. But he could have the opportunity to have a really big season this year for New England.
Yeah, I like that call a lot. Douglas, someone is in his rookie year, hits over 17% target share per game rate. That's definitely a strong number for a rookie wideout, let alone a day 3 rookie wideout, right? And
right.
then, he sees a 24% target per route run rate. He had a solid 1.7 yards per route run. I have a year 2 model, I call it, where I look at rookie season production alongside a player's prospect score. So my prospect model, and I kind of combine that and spit out a year 2 model or year 2 score to try to predict how well these guys are going to do in year 2 and year 3 of their NFL career. He scored an 85, which is completely irrelevant to, you don't know what that really means, but a guy in the 80 to 90 range, we've seen some hits. If they're above 90, that's when I'm like, okay, these guys are really, really solid. But to give you some context, Douglas was sort of in the same range as Michael Wilson, Dontavian Wicks, those types of players where, a lot of people are high on them and high on, what they might be able to do here in year 2. So I think Douglas, at the very least, like you said, he's a really, really safe option. One of his, I have what's called journey comparables, where I look at players who had similar prospect scores and then similar year 2 scores to see maybe this is the path that these guys will go down. One of Demario Douglas's was Hunter Renfrow, which of course now we see Renfrow in the way that things have gone for him. It's not the best, but
sure.
Year 3, Renfrow had a big season. He was still fine enough. He had some production in year 2. And to me, Douglas, just from a player stance and a player archetype stance, he's got more athletic ability than a guy like Renfrow has. So I think there's definitely some intrigue there.
Love it. JJ, give us your second sleeper.
Let's go with Brian Thomas. He's catching a little steam recently because he's from the preseason and in camp and such, and we're seeing him run in those 2 wide receiver sets with Gabe Davis. Actually, is what we've seen. Not really a Christian Kirk thing, but historically, if you look at right now, if you look at redraft rankings or ADP, sort of in that wide receiver 48 range ish, in the 40s and maybe even low 50s, just depending on your source, but the players who have had good prospect scores in that range historically, just rookie wide receivers in that range, they've smashed. They've done really, really well versus ADP expectation. My prospect model had the big 3. It had Neighbors and Marvin Harrison as elite prospects. And then it had Rome Odunze as a really good prospect too. It just wasn't on their level. And then the next 2, Xavier Worthy and Brian Thomas, actually graded not quite to Rome Odunze, but not that far off. Thomas had a score of 94.5 within my prospect model. Odunze was at 96 to 97. But since 2014, we've had 23 rookie wide receivers get selected in that wide receiver 40 to wide receiver 60 range with a prospect score within my model, the ZAP model, above 90. Those players outpaced their ADP expectation by 1.4 PPR points per game on average. 39% of them outperformed ADP expectation by 3 or more PPR points per game, that's what I call a moderate breakout. That's an insane rate. That's one of the best rates that you're going to find from almost any subset. So if you can get an elite wide receiver prospect who's a rookie in sort of that wide receiver 4 to wide receiver 5 into wide receiver 6 range. Those guys historically have been so good in fantasy football. And we have a lot of them this year. I mean, it's sort of a choose your own adventure in a way. And then, you look at the situation, he's probably going to play the Calvin Ridley role in Jacksonville. And that turns people off because Ridley was such a disappointment last year. But from an expected fantasy points per game standpoint, Ridley, depending on your formula and what you're looking at, Ridley was wide receiver 14 in expected fantasy points per game. He had a ton of end zone targets, a ton of looks down the field, the looks that we think Brian Thomas could hypothetically see within this offense. So I'm buying. I'm really into him. He's actually my highest exposed wide receiver in best ball right now. I just think he's a really, really good value.
Even if he just turns into Calvin Ridley, I mean, that's wide receiver 18 on a year in PPR, exactly. Right? That's a mid-range wide receiver too, which is a championship caliber player. And that's anytime you get anybody out of the ADP, out of the 36, anybody again who can put in your starting lineup, you feel really good about. And rookies are always the ultimate gamble and that sexy pick you want to get out there because it's unknown, right? And definitely when you get to the not so savvy fantasy player, like if you're in a redraft league with your family or work people, like they have no idea who these people even are. Yeah. Like Brian B. Thomas, like I don't even know who that is. Like give me Christian Kirk, or they see the name Gabe Davis and they just take Gabe Davis because they know he had a couple games where he went off and scored multiple touchdowns, but that's all he really does. And Brian Thomas is a more dynamic Gabe Davis, which is pretty crazy to say in itself. So again, those high upside rookies are always out there. And you said a lot this year, a lot last year, like these last couple of years been really blessed with like just being inundated with a ton of rookie talent at the receiver position and really making this pool so diverse and so much different ways you can go. But then again, the deeper the pool, the more the value is. And a rookie like Brian Thomas is definitely from a best ball standpoint. Oh my goodness. Like you can't get better than that. Yeah. Easy smash.
All right, Rich, give us your guy.
All right, so my last guy here is going to be Brandin Cooks of the Dallas Cowboys. Right now in Fantasy Pros he's going off as wide receiver 58. So like people are grabbing Brandin Cooks right now as like their 5th or 6th wide receiver off the board. And if you're in the news and you're following football right now, you know that there's nothing going on in that wide receiver room in Dallas. CeeDee Lamb is still holding out. Like now, do I anticipate CeeDee Lamb to get in camp before the season starts? Yeah, I do. But every day that goes by is more time that CeeDee needs to catch up and get acclimated to that offense. And right now, the way NFL training camps already work, we know like the NFL season, it doesn't really become a well-oiled machine until after the first month, right? Like as defenses aren't as astute as they should be. So Brandin Cooks for me is real intriguing in PPR leagues, who historically has always been a nice option in the passing game, right? Like as a wide receiver too. But you look last year as his first year in Dallas. If you look at it, it's like a 2-part story, right? Like the first part of that story is it's gross. It's Beauty and the Beast. It's the Beast. Belle doesn't know what's going on here. She's this big ugly thing in front of her and she's scared of it. But then on the second part of the story, where Brandin Cooks all of a sudden gets acclimated, he starts to take off. He starts to see his percentage of snaps increase, right? He's seen at least 70% of the snaps from that point out. So let's call it from week 10 through 17, kind of like we did in a podcast yesterday, Garrett. Like I consider the second half of the season for weeks 10 through 17. From that point on in PPR leagues, Brandin Cooks was wide receiver 14 overall in PPR leagues, which is again, a very high end wide receiver too. That's a championship caliber player that you're getting in as your wide receiver 5. And with nobody else around her, you kind of mentioned like the New England situation. Dallas isn't too much better, right? This offense isn't the Dallas we remember. The offensive line's not as good as it used to be. We have a grandfather at the start of running back and his grandson, Rico Dowdle, as his backup. And when it comes to actual receivers themselves, it's Jalen Tolbert down there. You have Jalen Brooks. That's it. There's not a lot of options here for Dak Prescott, who was the quarterback 2. If you go second half of the season, quarterback 1 overall, the second half of the season last year, and CeeDee Lamb finished as wide receiver 1. You have an offense here that's going to put up a lot of points and really go out there and stretch the field. And Brandin Cooks is really good at that. And what does Brandin Cooks win at too? Stretching the field. Like he's not as strong in those short intermediate routes, but he's really good getting outside the 10. So for me, get a guy at wide receiver 58 that can give you, let's say he takes a down tick for some reason and he's wide receiver 18, as a mid-range wide receiver 2, that's extremely good value. And the more that CeeDee Lamb sits out, the more opportunity that you have Brandin Cooks to like just hit the ground running in this offense and maybe put up some wide receiver 1 weeks here early on, week 1, week 2. And again, that might put you in a position where when we see in today's NFL, every single week we lose a starting NFL fantasy football player. Every single week where you have a guy out here who's putting up high end numbers. What a fantastic trade target. What a fantastic flex start. Or more importantly, what a great wide receiver 3 to have in your offense. It's giving you wide receiver 14 numbers. All signs right now are pointing to the same share of Brandin Cooks that we saw at the second half of the NFL season last year, which again, that all points to high-end wide receiver 2 numbers for Brandin Cooks.
Love it, Rich. I think that's a great call. I think he has a lot of upside in this offense, and you're right. With CeeDee Lamb holding out, it only presents more opportunity for other guys to potentially get their share. So let me get to the last guy here that we have for our Sleepers episode. And look, sometimes when you fall asleep and you're thinking of these sleepers, sometimes it's a nightmare, but sometimes it's a wonderful dream. And this wonderful dream of mine is of Tyjae Spears. Yes, if you've listened to the show any length of time, you know that I am a huge fan of this player, and I'm not backing off now. I get it. We have Tony Pollard there, and Tony Pollard, is he going to be a little bit annoying if you have Tyjae Spears? Absolutely. He's going to be involved. He's going to be part of this offense. But when you look at what Tyjae Spears did last year, Tyjae Spears was 5th overall in the NFL in yards per touch at the running back position. And he was 7th in running back target share. So those pass catching opportunities, even with a guy like Will Levis that's slinging the ball down the field, he had the opportunity to catch a lot of passes in this offense and do a lot with it. The biggest issue last year for this offense was that offensive line. The entire offensive line was doo-doo butter. I mean, it was booty butt cheeks, dumpster juice, whatever you want to call it. It was bad. Like, it was not good at all. But what do you do to help improve an offensive line? Well, you take a guy that should have been a guard but was currently a tackle, and you move him to guard like he should be. And that's what Skoronski did this year. Then you draft in the first round, you take a guy like J.C. Latham, a top offensive tackle that's going to do a lot of good things. Then you get a guy like Cushenberry for center, and then arguably the biggest move is getting Bill Callahan, this legendary offensive line coach that wherever he's gone, he's made that offensive line, whether they were already studs or they were guys that they pulled off the waiver wire, he turns them into Pro Bowl caliber offensive line units. So whatever he does well. So if we're already seeing that type of efficiency, 5th in yards per touch for Tyjae Spears with that bad of an offensive line, imagine what he can do with a good unit. Imagine what he can do if there's actually holes there available for him. So look, I get it. The Tony Pollard stuff, not ideal, but he wouldn't be a sleeper if Tony Pollard wasn't there. He would be up there as a top 12 type of running back that we would be talking about up there. This is your opportunity to get him low. And if there's any player that would just absolutely feast if somebody were to sustain an injury, it would be Tyjae Spears if something were to ever happen to Tony Pollard.
Yeah, Garret, too. Oh, sorry, JJ. Right. Real quick before JJ goes, because I want JJ to wrap it up, is going on that Bill Callahan news too. I think a lot of people don't realize is not only is he a Hall of Fame offensive line coach, Bill Callahan is also really involved in the run scheme and game planning of the run game as well. And he historically has a high end output there as well. So I just want to put that in there as well about Bill Callahan.
Love it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, look, Brian Callahan is head coach right now. If you look back at what he did in Cincinnati, even without Joe Burrow, they've been they were a really pass heavy unit. So he'll probably bring that and some more 11 personnel to this Tennessee offense. That's why they went out and they got Calvin Ridley and they signed Tyler Boyd, to get pieces that really fit that 11 personnel well. And you mentioned that the pass catching stuff. Tyjae Spears had the 6th best target share per game rate of any rookie running back since 2011 this past year. And the guys that were ranked ahead of him are Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson, Christian McCaffrey, and Tariq Cohen is the last one. But Tariq Cohen was an RB2 during his second year in the league. Like, he was a really dynamic pass catcher. This is one thing that I try to preach and been preaching for years and years, is that when you're looking at middle round running backs, a lot of people are like, no, I need to get the Zamir White types because they have the backfield all by themselves. Well, that's kind of a problem. What does it say if they have the backfield, quote, all by themselves and they're still only middle round picks? It's probably subconsciously telling you, or the market's telling you, that the situation's not very good in general, right? Otherwise, they'd be drafted higher, or the player himself is not very good. When you have these ambiguous backfields, whether you're looking at Tennessee, Cincinnati, even Pittsburgh, they're telling you that not only could these guys just live up to expectation stand alone without an injury. But what happens, as you noted with Tony Pollard, if Tony Pollard goes down, and you can make the argument in the flip, like in the reverse, like I don't think Pollard's even that bad of a pick. I just prefer Spears because of price and talent. And he's a second-year guy. We know the pass catching is there, all of that. But I don't even think Pollard's that bad of a pick. But so you're attacking these ambiguous backfields because not only could a talent just naturally emerge, and we see it all the time, but there's the injury upside, the contingent upside from that perspective too. So even if nothing happens, these guys can live up to ADP expectation, but there's that ceiling that they can hit, if something were to happen to their backfield teammate.
Awesome. Love it. Love it. Love it. I love it when you guys love the guys I love. So with that, we are going to wrap up this episode. JJ, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come on, join us here. I think, if I'm not wrong, I think this is your Dynasty Nerds debut. So, congratulations.
I think so too. I know it's crazy because obviously you guys have been around for a while. I've been around for a while. So it's good to finally connect and do a show together.
Absolutely. We loved having you. Rich, anything else before we get out of here, my friend?
No, I'm just pumped that we're talking sleepers. That means football is right around the corner and it actually counts for real. And I encourage everybody, make sure you follow JJ on Twitter and get his material. It is high end stuff. And you're always looking for your edge, right? Like that's the difference. Everybody, we talk about sleepers where like it's hard to find sleepers, which means if it's hard to find sleepers, it's fine. It's hard to find an edge in your league because everybody's getting that same information. So you have to identify where like you get the edge. And we're a dynasty podcast and we've made a name for ourselves giving you that edge in your dynasty leagues. When it comes to redraft, I can't recommend JJ enough to get that edge. Where everybody else is going right, he's to help you go slightly left. And that's why I love having somebody like JJ on the show to help our audience get that edge. Because we're all here for one reason and one reason only. And that's to hold that trophy at the end of the year and talk down to all the people that finish lower than us.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back. Make sure you subscribe to the page. Tons of content coming out every single day here at dynastynerds.com. We'll see you guys next time.